Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. Have you ever thought about why you work 5 days a week or 8 hours a day? Why are the weekends only 2 days long? Research suggests that there could be real benefits to reducing employees' working hours and shortening the overall working week. This episode is going to look at the history of working hours and then discuss whether it would be better for everyone if our weekends were longer and our working hours were shorter. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English podcast, or the link is in the description. And you definitely should look at our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all of the transcripts and bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. To entitle. To entitle. To give someone the right to do or have something. For example, children and the elderly are entitled to cheap train tickets. Trade union. Trade union. A trade union is an organization that represents the people who work in a particular industry. It protects their rights and discusses their pay and working conditions with employers. As in, the government's proposals have been strongly criticized by the trade unions. To compensate. To compensate. To pay money in exchange for work done. For instance, that company compensates their employees really well. Productivity. Productivity. Productivity is the rate at which a person, company, or country does useful work. For instance, a pleasant working environment increases productivity. Invoice. Invoice. An invoice is a statement listing goods or services provided and their prices, and it's used in business as a record of sale. For instance, you need to have a copy of your original invoice if you want a refund. Obstacle. Obstacle. An obstacle is something that blocks you so that movement, going forward, or action is prevented or made difficult. For example, money seems to be no obstacle. Output. Output. Output is an amount of something produced by a person, a machine, a factory, a country, etc. As in, last year, manufacturing output fell by 14%. Abundance. Abundance. Abundance is a situation in which there is more than enough of something. For example, the area has an abundance of lakes, rivers, and streams to swim in. How many hours do you work a week? Do you feel like you work too much? Would you rather work less hours? How would working less affect your performance and your productivity? If I had to guess, I assume that most people listening to this podcast work around 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But have you ever thought about why you work to this schedule? Why do you need to work 5 days a week? Why do we have a 2-day weekend? What would happen if we worked less? The answers to these questions are actually really interesting and maybe a little unexpected. This episode is going to look at the history of working hours and then discuss whether it would be better for everyone if our weekends were longer and the time we spend in the office is reduced. For most countries, standard working hours are normally between 40 and 44 hours, over 5 days a week. Standard working hours are the laws which limit how many hours an employee is able to work. And if you work more than the standard hours, often you are entitled to receive overtime pay, which can sometimes be up to 50% more per hour. Of course, the law is different in every country, and it is probably different in your country. Standard working hours vary from 35 hours a week in France all the way up to 112 hours a week in North Korean labor camps. However, limiting working hours and 5-day working weeks is a relatively new development in the history of labor. For most of human history, we worked when we needed to, or we wanted to, or we were made to by the landowners and the property owners. In Christian Europe, Sunday, as the religious holy day, was usually a day when people would attend church instead of working. Actually, I say attend church, but often people would also do many non-religious events on Sundays. By the time of the Industrial Revolution in the UK and Western Europe, it became clear that people were not happy working long hours in factories 6 days a week. 19th century bosses eventually began to offer shorter working hours on Saturdays, or even the whole day off, to encourage workers to work hard the rest of the week. Trade unions and leading figures like Henry Ford, who was the founder of the Ford Motoring Company, began to promote 5-day, 40-hour working weeks. And after a few decades, governments started to put it into law. In 1936, France put the 40-hour week into law, and the USA followed with legislation in 1938 and 1940. In the OECD, which is essentially a group of rich countries, full-time workers spent about 40.1 hours per week at work. The purpose behind limiting working hours and working weeks was to be fairer on employees. Without protection, workers could be forced to work too many hours in unsafe conditions and without being compensated fairly. For companies as well, these laws actually often made employees better workers. They were less tired and happier and often more productive. Working 7 days a week, full time, doesn't work really in any situation. Over the last 50 years, more and more countries have been following the European examples. And China, for instance, introduced 5 working days in 1995, so relatively recently. Overall, the idea of a 5-day working week with around 40 working hours is quite new. It has not been a permanent part of human history. For someone like me, who always likes to ask questions and think critically about situations, I often ask myself, do we really need this concept of a working week anymore? What would happen if we had a 3-day weekend, or we just had completely flexible hours? Well, this is actually a topic that has been in the news more and more over the years. A report released earlier this month covered a series of trials conducted in Iceland by the Reykjavik City Council and Iceland's government between 2015 and 2019. These trials reduced the working hours of 3,000 workers to 35 or 36 hours a week, but it kept them on the same salary, even with the decrease in hours. Interestingly, the researchers discovered that despite employees working less hours, productivity didn't fall. On the contrary, productivity actually improved in some places. For example, Reykjavik's Department of Accountancy reported a 6.5% increase in the number of invoices processed during the trial compared with a year before. Moreover, the workers who participated in the trial said they felt less stressed and healthier, and men started to spend more time doing housework and childcare. I actually have 2 episodes, one on housework and one on birth rates, if you want to learn more about this issue of men doing housework. The trials in Iceland have been so successful that workers' unions across the country pushed the government to introduce national legislation to reduce working hours. And now 86% of all workers in Iceland have moved or can move to shorter hour contracts. In other parts of the world, companies are also increasingly open to the idea of shorter working hours or more flexible hours. In fact, Microsoft and the American hamburger chain Shake Shack have also experimented with 4-day weeks. Britain's trade unions made 4-day working weeks one of their main goals a few years ago, and other trials have been held in Sweden and New Zealand. Almost every trial results in happier, healthier, and more motivated employees. And people who work shorter weeks are always more productive. So why don't we change the way we work? Why don't we work less hours? Well, there are some major obstacles and challenges in the way. First, workers may not choose to work less hours, especially if their pay or salary is reduced. In France, for instance, the full-time working week was reduced to 35 hours in 2000, but workers on average still work closer to 40 hours a week, as they are happy to take extra salary and vacation allowances in return for the extra hours. Second, for people like me, a 4-day week doesn't really help. I'm a research student, and occasionally I do a little bit of teaching online. Teaching online, especially the way I do it, is part of what is called the gig economy. I have no salary. Instead, like delivery drivers and Uber drivers and other gig economy employees, I get paid only for the work I do, only for the hours I work or the minutes I work, really. So reducing my hours would reduce my earning considerably. Unfortunately, when people think about issues such as the work-life balance, they tend to be thinking of white-collar workers, professionals on fixed salaries. These people's jobs often connect more, or I guess aim towards completing a goal, completing a task. Maybe you have to make a presentation, or maybe you have to write a report, and that is your project for the day. So with that report, if you write it in 1 hour or if you write it in 12 hours, it's up to you. But by completing that report, you have completed your work. For people who are paid per hour, working in supermarkets or on construction sites or English teachers on the internet, reducing the working week could have serious negative consequences. And it's unlikely that people like me would choose to do that. Third, businesses and companies might also be reluctant to allow workers to work less hours. While workers are more productive if they work fewer hours, and I'm not denying this, overall, output may actually fall because people are working less hours. Let me try to explain. Just because you're more productive does not mean you do the same amount of work. Let's say we have a normal factory worker who works 40 hours a week. And he's very good at his job. He can make 10 products an hour. So that means he makes 400 products a week. Now we reduce his hours, and he becomes more productive. Now he can make 10.1 products an hour. But he only works 35 hours a week. So although he can make more products every hour, overall, he will only make 353.5 products a week. So that's almost 50 less. So although he's making more an hour, because he works 5 less hours, he is still making less. And this is not desirable for businesses, the government, or the economy. While there are challenges, many people still think it is worth the change. Although it may not boost the economy, it will improve many people's lives. They will be healthier and happier. Furthermore, if companies are prepared to make changes in the way they work, then reducing hours could be really successful. Microsoft Japan ran a trial in 2019, and by reducing meetings and encouraging online meetings, sales per employee increased by 40% on average. If you look online for Netflix's website and Netflix's, employee description, they have a really interesting work culture, which allows employees to, decide how many days they have vacation by themselves, decide what time they start work and how many hours they work. As long as they do what they have to do, finish their projects, it's okay. And it's this kind of flexible system that I think will become more and more common in the future. A few years ago, if we had been talking about changing the way we work, it would seem like a fantasy situation. However, the way the pandemic has changed, the way we work has changed completely in the pandemic. It has made it clear that new ways of working are possible, and companies can be flexible. All of those companies that used to say online meetings were impossible and they cannot be organized, well, the only way they have survived is by using online meetings. And people working at home probably are not working 8 hours a day in the same way they used to in their offices. So perhaps reducing working hours no longer seems as crazy as it used to. Final thought. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes hoped that one day we would live in an age of leisure and abundance, when technology is so advanced that workers will need to only work 15 hours a week. And the biggest challenge facing people would be how to spend their free time. Do you think this world will ever be possible? Or do you expect to keep working 5 days a week for the rest of your life? What is working life like in your country? Do you come from a culture that works too much, spends too much time at the office? Or do you come from a culture that prioritizes free time? Let me know. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Thinking in English. Please share with your friends, check out our social media links in the description, and send us a message. We really appreciate all of your feedback. And if you have any ideas for topics or future podcast guests or any other learning format, please let us know. And please leave me a rating. We're now on Instagram. I'm sure you've already seen it, but go there, check it out. Lots of good content about vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. And Instagram is a great way to contact me. It's Thinking in English Podcast on Instagram, or the link is in the description. Also, all of the transcripts of the podcast are now available on the Thinking in English blog. Vocabulary list, comprehension questions, and all of the articles are there for you to read. That link is also in the description, so please check it out too. Thank you, and see you next time.